Hello, community, and welcome back to another Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, C-Suite Trusted Advisor, Elite Team Strategist, and Board Director, preparing businesses to navigate culture, complexity, and change. We are back for our second of April series, Real Conversations from the C-Suite with Mr. Leo Bottary. He is the founder and CEO of Peernovation LLC and the author of a new book by the same title, and Jim Roberts, who is the president of Jim Roberts Enterprises LLC. Gentlemen, welcome back, and let's get going, shall we? So we ended the last conversation talking about busting a few myths and Jim giving us a few items that CEOs really need to think about in terms of DEI to keep it from being either too personalized or politicized. But before we go into that conversation a little bit further, Leo, I want to ask you how Peernovation can help CEOs grapple with tough challenges like DEI. It has been politicized, it's polarizing, and people are just downright uncomfortable when you even just say DEI. But this is not the only type of controversial challenge that CEOs are dealing with right now. So how would you recommend approaching challenging conversations like this? But yes, let's focus on DEI.
Well, a couple things. One, just participating in a group puts you in a situation where you are likely to be around people that aren't necessarily just like you. Oftentimes in social situations, in business, things like that, we hang around people that look like us, think like us, and all of that. Now you go into a CEO peer group and you find yourself, yes, they're all CEOs, but they come from different walks of life. They're from different race, gender, experiences, all of these kinds of things that they bring to the table. And one of the things I think it does for those CEOs, it allows them to step into the deep end of the pool and actually experience what this is all about, experience the idea that the more perspectives I can have access to, the richer we can all be for it. So I think that's number one. Second, and whether it happens to be DEI or any other tough challenge that CEOs are going through, they can talk about what's happening in their particular organizations, and they can share some of what they're experiencing and some of what's going on. And in part, I think they can come to the realization that they're not in this alone. And yet how much they can still learn, from one another about what we do and how we do it. I think there is a point, and I think it was brought up earlier, just regarding a situation of language. Oftentimes when I talk about building CEO groups or peer advisory groups for any level of business leaders, it's really about, do we have all the voices around the table that can contribute to the robust conversation and the whole conversation that we want to have? And I think if you can say yes to that question, the chances are good that you're going to have a really diverse audience or number of participants there, right, in order to make that possible. So I think, again, once we experience it, once we not get caught up in language, and once we recognize that, if we're going to serve our employees, our customers, our shareholders, our communities, we have to understand them better and not just from our singular perspective. And I think groups provide people the laboratory to do that.
When you mention all the different aspects of an organization, to me, that brings to mind the term, the organizational ecosystem, which is what I like to use. But I wanted to pull the thread on a couple of things that you said. First of all, when you talk about different CEOs and when you talk about all the voices, to the best of my knowledge, most CEOs in corporate America are still primarily white males. Now, when you talk about the different voices up and down the chain from the front lines to the CEO, I would think that you would not only get more voices, more variety and difference of voices, but you would also get different lived experiences that lend to that robust conversation. So in your experience leading conversations with CEOs, how diverse are they really? And I'm not just talking about the different backgrounds, but it's still primarily white males, or am I wrong?
No, I think that's a fair point. But also, I think what people who lead these groups are very proactive about doing is making sure that they are trying to attract and recruit a broader group than white males to the group, because they recognize how important and how valuable that is. And I do see that trend moving in the right direction. And I think a lot of groups are benefiting from that, and they appreciate that, they enjoy it. and they kind of really kind of tap into what the benefit of that is all about.
Thank you for that. Jim, let me turn to you next. And let's say that we're talking to a group of Leo's folks. He's been gracious enough to invite us into the room for a conversation. And there is a variety of differences in lived experiences, but maybe not necessarily in terms of race or ethnicity. How would you go about having the discussion about the fact that it's a myth that middle management should be primarily responsible for DEI when we know that middle management really doesn't have a whole lot of say in these types of initiatives?
That's correct. I mean, I'm a member of and on the board for the Michigan Minority Supplier Development Council. So we work with a lot of different corporations. There's over 400 corporations that are part of our organization. And for those who try to implement and sustain supplier initiatives at a middle management level, they're doomed to fail. You know, one of the things that really is out there is they have, you know, people think that they have the impact and the knowledge of what's going on, but they don't have the say. They don't have the corporate resources behind them. So to really make it happen, you need to have the C-suites being involved with this. And the most effective companies that I've seen have had in their C-suite, the CEO has said that part of their C-suite team's performance appraisals include DEI type initiatives, and not just from a feel-good perspective, but economic perspective. How are we adding that in to our shareholders and making it a sustainable and strategic vision for the company?
You also mentioned the fact that DEI is essentially dealing with change management. Tell us a little bit about that from your perspective. And then Leo, I'm going to kick it over to you in terms of how we can help CEOs who may not understand that that's really what this is, to have those conversations, those challenging conversations. So Jim, tell us about DEI as essentially being change management, because I agree with you 100%. And I know I've just posed a question to you, but it brings to mind the fact that I consider myself a CEO trusted advisor and facilitator of C-suite teams becoming elite teams for that very reason, to give them that space to not be uncomfortable about not knowing what they don't know, but to help them to understand that they set the tone at the top and that without them, middle managers really are handicapped.
Right. So let's go with the change management concept here. So let's take a look at anything that's out there. We could talk about automobiles. We could talk about telephones, communication services. And if you look at, let's use telephones. If I came to you, Dr. Anita, or if I came to you, Leo, and said, hey, let's invest in a mass market payphone network, that we're going to go out and put payphones on everybody's street corner, would you do that? No. The technology has changed. Same thing with cars. The cars of 20 years ago look very different than the cars today, that are going to look very different than the cars that are 20 years from now. So everything is change management, and so is the demographics. So what appeals to a certain demographic now is going to be very different than that demographic in the future. And so we have to look at it strategically as change management. It's all just change. I mean, we are adaptive. We're an adaptive society, and it's just a fundamental thing that we look at and that we're good at. So let's take the things that we're good at and make our economy better.
Jim, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Obviously, I agree with you on a variety of points. We've had conversations. The question is still, though, with all the data that exists as to why it's a good thing to do, the question that I'm leaning into with my clients and different executives that I talk to is, what's your why not? So, Leo, I'm going to turn back to you. What's the why not in these peer groups? And what is the hesitation, whether they want to see it as DEI or whether they want to see it as change management? What's the barrier that's getting in the way from even having the discussion? And before I let you answer that, I was talking with another client about 2 weeks ago, and they are firm that they are not backing away from the language. They're still committed to the work, and that's great. But the topic that we had was, how do we talk to current clients or potential clients? And my suggestion was, if DEI and the terminology is uncomfortable, but they still want to do the work, how about we lean into the work based on their values and what they say they value as a corporation and how they're demonstrating those values in terms of inclusive influence. So where do we take CEOs in that direction?
Well, I mean, you make a great point. I mean, we can't get, held hostage by language. It's really about the practice and what's good for everybody. When you involve everyone, when you have, the perspectives of everyone is involved. I don't think there's a hesitancy among CEOs, at least in groups, to have the conversation. That's what they do. That's what they're built to do. And this is why I think that they, come away with insights that are really helpful for them in terms of leading their organization. So, and they're not, I don't care who the CEO is, whether it's a white male, African-American male, Hispanic, woman CEO, everyone recognizes that the world is changing. Everyone recognizes that their customer base, their employee base, everything is changing, and that they have to recognize, how do we lead today? The other thing that layers into this, of course, and you, I think, alluded to it, was just the generational differences. 55 years ago, when Robert K. Greenleaf talked about servant leadership, it was anathema to the way anyone talked about leadership at all. It was the idea of servant leader in the same word group didn't make any sense at all. It was an oxymoron. It was didn't make any sense. And yet, when you look at Peter Senge and his favorite definition of leadership today, the capacity of a human community to shape its future, or many other leaders who were talking about what leading really is about, it's not command and control anymore. It's not about how can I use the team to make me look good. It's how can I, as the leader, create the conditions for my team to be most successful. And I think part of creating those conditions involves making sure that you have access to all of the perspectives, all of the voices that you need in order for everybody to be successful on every level.
I appreciate that. And it's true. We need everybody to be successful at every level, from the boots on the ground all the way up to even the board. With that thought in mind, Jim, I want to come back to you and give you the last word in this particular conversation. When we're talking about the board helping to ensure rock solid top management support, where does that conversation come in with the CEO, and how would a board approach that?
Well, I think it would be one of the things that I think is very important is to understand who your shareholders are. So, your shareholders, most of them are going to be institutional investors. So if you take a look at those institutional investors, you've got a number of different large firms that are out there that have fundamental investment philosophies that they are requiring. If you take a look at the S&P 500, on average, 70% of all shares held by, being held by for a company are being held by institutional investors. And those institutional investors have very specific ESG requirements that they're looking at strategically. And it's not just US based, because those companies, or those large investment institutional investors, have clients and companies that are in other, parts of the world. So they're looking at it from a global perspective. So again, it just goes back to shareholder and stakeholder value. And you have to make sure that you understand that. I think the perception, or most people, when I talk to them, don't even think about the shareholders. A lot of people are frightened by, these shareholder activists and all that. Well, if 70% of the shares are being held by institutional investors, and you are cultivating that relationship as a board and a CEO with those institutional investors, you're going to have, the vote power to continue to do things in a strategic manner that adds value to your shareholders and to the stakeholders in the community.
Again, it goes back to what I call the organizational ecosystem. And it also points to being a good, not only corporate citizen, but a good global citizen, I think, for all involved. Community, this is a great place to pause this conversation. I told you that I had some heavy hitters for you this month, and I know that they are delivering on my promise. So I want to encourage you to please come back. If this podcast has done anything to raise your awareness about changing culture, please share it on LinkedIn with your own comments. This is a learning community, and I want to know what you have to say. And stay in the flow with me. Follow, like, and overshare any of my podcasts that help you reframe diversity and hot topic conversations from difficult to different. Until next time, this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real.